The Sony A7R II has been out for quite a while now, and it's been almost 4 years to the month right now that Sony hasn't improved or given us a firmware update on the A7R II. Now, why would they give us an update at this point in time on the A7R II? The camera's been discontinued. It would be a good decision on Sony's part to improve the A7R II. It shows customers customer support and the legacy product. There's people that are still switching brands from Canon to the Sony ecosystem. Sometimes the only way we can do that is to buy the more affordable used options such as the A7R II. Now we may be buying the cheaper camera, but that still opens us up to buying new lenses and just overall expanding the product line and the consumer base that uses this camera line. So why not continue to support it out a little further? Now I get there's newer cameras that do all the newer stuff and Sony wants to sell new cameras, not old cameras, especially ones that are discontinued. I don't think you can buy a new A7R II anymore. But there's still a lot of us out there shooting this camera, and there's still a lot of us out here buying this camera because it's such a great bargain. I mean, there's this new camera battle going on between Canon, Nikon, and Sony and who has the cheapest full frame. Well, it's still Sony because they sold the A7R II. And you can pick this camera up pre-owned basically for about $1,200 or less, and that's a really good deal for a fantastic camera. So I would like to see Sony update this camera one last time. I think that's about all it has in it. Let's call it version 5, and this is my wish list for what version 5 firmware should have in it. So Sony, if you're watching this, you're paying attention to your customer base, and I know you do, let's see these improvements done to this camera, or at least something, give us something more in the A7R II for being just such loyal customer base with such a great, fantastic camera. Now, if you haven't checked your firmware update, I'm going to show you how to do that right now. But I'm not going to show you how to update your firmware in this video, because I feel there's plenty of videos out there covering that topic, and nothing's changed since those videos were made. So please search for one of the videos showing you how to do the firmware update. But to check for your firmware update, we're going to turn the camera on. And we're going to go to the menu, and then from the menu we're going to select all the way to the right to the briefcase, and you're going to go down, and I believe it's on page 6. We're at the very bottom of page 6 of the briefcase. It says version. You're going to click on the version and it'll say the body and the version 4.01. Now if you have a lens attached right below this, it'll say the lens, and the lens version is lenses also require firmware updates at times. So once you verify that you have the latest firmware update into your Sony A7R II, that is 4.01, let's talk about what we'd like to see in a future update. Not that Sony ever will, but what are some of the things that I think this camera could do through just firmware alone without major hardware upgrades? So here's my list of 9 things I think Sony could do still to this camera to improve its quality and help keep it alive a little bit longer. Here we are with item number 1. So the first thing I would want to see done is the lens database update. Now I don't know how Sony does the lens data into an older camera. If the lenses have what they need or how they operate and it downloads it into the camera when it's attached. If it does, it's totally silent to us and we don't know nothing about it. How does the camera know how to operate with a new lens that's just come out, say, last month, when this camera's last update was 4 years ago? So I'd like to see some sort of improvement to the lens database update. Now, if you do go and look on Sony's e-support documentation of the lens compatibility charts, which I'll have another video for that, but you'll see that it's not fully compatible with all the lenses. Most lenses are 100% compatible. There is one lens out there that this camera is more than deserving of, and that's the new 50mm G Master lens with the f1.2. And it's an issue with the aperture ring the aperture settings not recording properly into the camera. So I would like to see that lens update be performed and update this camera to include that data. Number 2, second thing I think that Sony should do is improve the autofocus a little bit. Now, while I think this algorithm in this is a great system, I feel like there's probably room for some improvement. I've always struggled with autofocus systems in the A7R II with lower light situations where it just doesn't want to grab a subject. Whereas when I pull up the A7 III, it would snap onto the subject instantly in the same lighting conditions with the same lens, where this camera struggles. So I'd like to see an algorithm update that I think could be done with just firmware alone with what they've learned since the last update to help improve the autofocus system. And improvements with the speed and the performance and the accuracy of the eye autofocus would be much needed as well. Considering it's been 4 years since the last update, I'm sure Sony could improve the autofocus in this camera just a little bit with firmware updates alone. And whether it be just algorithm updates, better improvements to the eye autofocus system, stuff of that nature, it doesn't necessarily require hardware, I don't think, but they could probably squeeze the envelope with what the processor's capability is right now. The third thing I would like to see done, incorporating the different aspect ratios that the newer cameras shoot. And that's basically the 4:3 and the 1:1 aspect ratio. Right now, this camera will shoot in the 32, which is the full image sensor, and it'll also shoot in a 16:9. Well, personally, I only choose to shoot in the 3:2 format because I shoot RAW and I want the full image and data there in my post-processing. I can see a benefit with the creators that are buying this camera, who are starting out, who want a full frame camera, who are going direct onto Instagram or into social media platforms where maybe just the 1:1 crop would be perfect for them. It'll probably help them figure out their compositions a little bit better if the camera's just already formatted for it. So I'd like to see that improvement done, and I think that's a simple, easy software firmware type update. All right, the fourth improvement I'd like to see done with the A7R2 is the color choices for the focusing grid. In the newest cameras and some of the newer ones, they give you the option of choosing, I think, gray or green or red. Now I'd love to see the red outlines for the autofocus or for the flexible spot, anything like that, to be incorporated into this camera as well. Being that it's just a color change, I think that's something that easily a firmware update could handle. Real quick, before moving on my wish list, I just want to say thank you for stopping by and supporting this channel. Each and every one of you that watches this channel are amazing, and I appreciate every one of you. If you would mind hitting that like button and going down and subscribing below, it would be highly appreciated. Okay, so point number 5 that I would like to see done on the A7R2 and a firmware update is custom key assignments. Now, while the A7R2 has a tremendous amount of programmability in the custom keys and be able to reconfigure this camera for your liking, what is lacking is the fact that you can't change it for multiple functions. There's one assignment and that is it. So you're limited to only the slots that are available for trying to handle photo and video modes. If you are just a photo shooter, that's fine. And that's where the primary reason that this camera, I think, exists. For somebody who has a need for the video and has this camera, or wants to be able to be a hybrid shooter with a high resolution camera and be under that price point of what these things are valued at, I would love to see them increase the capability of that by adding a second set for video as well as photo in the custom key assignment. All right, my 6th item on my wish list for firmware, and that would be to improve the video filing system. Currently shooting this camera, when you go and shoot a video, it labels the video with their generic label. Now, one of the things they did fix in the 4.01 firmware update, they added a set file name function. Now, that set file name allows you to go in and program the camera to read whatever beginning file name you want as it takes photos. Downside is it only did it for photos. Now, if you're shooting video with the A7R2, when you stick your memory card in and you start recording a movie, or you start recording with it in video, it labels the file as, I think, like a C011 or whatever. And then you click the second one and it'll continue that trend, and it'll continue to itemize them out in numerical order as long as you have that card in. The second you remove that card and you stick another card in, or you dump that card and put it back in, it now resets that movie counter, and the movie files come in as the same 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, this isn't necessarily always a problem, but it does cause a problem in the filing system, because when you go to copy the first card over to a file, say for day 1, but then say day 1 extended on and you had a second card and you want to copy that into a folder, you have to separate those files as, like, say, card 2 into day 1. And that's because they all have the same file names. Now, this continues to become an issue when you're in the post-processing and editing, trying to find the file names. You'd have to literally rename the files to keep track of them. And I find that this camera will be more than capable of probably handling that file naming with a firmware update. All right, so the last 3 things I think that this camera could potentially do, that maybe it's a hardware limitation, but I'd like to see done and implemented. So number 7 would be the introduction of an HLG or hybrid log shooting for this camera. Being that it's capable of shooting S-Log2 but not S-Log3, I wonder if there's really a limitation there, or if it was just a feature that Sony didn't want to put into it. Now, this camera doesn't really benefit from S-Log3 necessarily, because the bit rate's just not there to support the footage. But S-Log2 has a similar issue, but it can do it. Now, HLOG or HLG came out after this camera was released, but I think, considering that my XPR TV got an HDR update, I would think that maybe this camera has the capability of shooting hybrid log, and that would be a great inclusion also to help improve some of the video features of this camera. And I would like to see HLG added in to one of the picture profiles. So the 8th item I think Sony could include in this camera in a firmware update would be the pixel shift system from the A7Rii. Now, being that the A7Rii is basically the exact same sensor that's in this camera, just in the newer modern body, the hardware in this should be very similar. And the A7Rii has pixel shift technology. Now, if you're not familiar with pixel shift, basically a system of moving the sensor over 1 pixel in 4 different directions to gain a 160 megapixel image from a single exposure. Now, the camera is going to take 4 exposures to do this, and it's Sony's software that actually takes that image and develops it into a 169 megabyte file for you to go and edit off of. Now, while this is kind of a gimmicky thing and I don't know how many people are actually using it, I know I would definitely try using it if I was taking a very static photo of a city nightscape or something. I would want to try to use this pixel shift technology. If it's got everything in the hardware department to handle it, why not give us that feature at this point in time? We're not taking away from anything, I think, in the new sales of new cameras, but if the camera is capable of it, why not throw it in a firmware update? All right, the 9th and final thing that's on my wish list for the new improvements to the A7R II on a firmware update would be battery performance. Battery performance in this camera, it's good. Won't say it's great. It's definitely not up to par of the Z100 batteries. These W series batteries, they're a little weak in this camera. They work and get the job done. I would love to see an improvement anywhere they can internally to help improve that battery life. The other option is if they provided a new W series battery, say call it the W70, where they improve the performance of this battery pack by packing a little bit more juice into it in the same package. If they can do that and then give us a firmware update to support the battery, that would be awesome. Definitely something to think about is getting improved battery life out of the A7R II. All right, guys, so that is it for me tonight. That is the 9 things I'd like to see done on the trusty old A7R II. You never know. Maybe Sony will watch this video and they'll say, hey, it's a good idea. But it's unlikely we'll ever see any more improvements to the A7R II. It's a discontinued camera. Why would Sony continue to invest in it? Just keep in mind the reasons I mentioned earlier in this video, why I think it'd be a great idea. It's probably not going to happen. So if you want newer features, you're going to have to buy a new camera. And maybe the Canon camera is a better deal. Maybe a new Nikon is what is looking like a better opportunity to buy, as they release cheaper full frame cameras that Sony's not filling the market on. They have a really good camera right here, and if they think about supporting it used in the used market and bringing a photographer or videographer to the Sony ecosystem on a used purchase, they're still gaining a customer for the future. And I think it'd be a smart decision going forward to consider something like this for the A7R II. That's it for me tonight, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you found something entertaining or educational about it. So anyways, it was great seeing you again, and I'll talk to you later. We'll see you in the next video, and got something more planned for the A7R II. We'll talk to you later. Bye.